Rebecca and Thomas Winslow's love story began like a fairy tale. They met as undergraduates at Wellesley College, where Rebecca studied art and Thomas pursued a degree in business administration. Rebecca captivated Thomas from the moment he saw her by the campus lake. Thomas, tall and charismatic with a disarming smile, wooed Rebecca with his charm and ambition. They married shortly after graduation, with dreams of building a life together in their hometown. Rebecca secured a position as an art teacher at Newton High School, where her passion for creativity and nurturing young talent quickly made her a favorite among students and faculty alike. Thomas, leveraging his family connections, landed a job at a prestigious local investment firm, climbing the corporate ladder with remarkable speed. As the years passed, the Winslows became pillars of the Wellesley community. They were fixtures at galas and town council meetings. Their home in Brookline became a symbol of their success, purchased with Thomas's growing wealth. Rebecca's artistic touch was evident in every room, from the hand-painted murals in the living room to the carefully curated sculptures in their backyard. To the outside world, Rebecca and Thomas were the epitome of a power couple. They complemented each other perfectly. Rebecca's creativity balanced Thomas's business acumen. Her warmth softened his sometimes brusque demeanor. Friends often remarked on how they still looked at each other with the same adoration they had in college. Yet, beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, there were undercurrents of tension. Rebecca and Thomas had been trying to conceive for years without success. The strain of fertility treatments and dashed hopes began to wear on their relationship. Thomas threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the office, while Rebecca found solace in her art and her students. It was during this challenging time that Rebecca's relationship with her mother, Margaret Lawson, became a source of comfort and support. Margaret, a widow who lived on the outskirts of town, had always been a free spirit. In her youth, she had traveled the world as a photojournalist, settling down in Wellesley only after meeting Rebecca's father. After his passing, Margaret retreated into a quieter life, focusing on her garden and her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. As Rebecca spent more time with her mother, Thomas found himself drawn into Margaret's orbit as well. What began as polite conversation during family dinners slowly evolved into something more, setting the stage for a betrayal that would tear the Winslow family apart. The seeds of the affair between Thomas and Margaret were planted on a crisp autumn evening. Rebecca, consumed with preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work, was preoccupied. Thomas, feeling neglected and frustrated by the growing distance in his marriage, decided to visit Margaret's cottage alone, ostensibly to check on his mother-in-law. Margaret, surprised but pleased by the unexpected visit, welcomed Thomas with a warm smile and a glass of her homemade wine. As they sat in her small, cluttered living room, surrounded by eclectic souvenirs from her travels, Thomas found himself opening up about his marital troubles. Margaret listened with empathy, her eyes, so similar to Rebecca's, filled with understanding. Perhaps it was the wine, the intimate atmosphere, or simply the need for human connection. But that night, a line was crossed. A comforting touch lingered too long. Gaze held more meaning than it should have. By the time Thomas left Margaret's cottage, both knew that something had irrevocably changed. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Margaret manufactured reasons to see each other. Margaret suddenly needed help with home repairs, while Thomas discovered a newfound interest in gardening. Their clandestine meetings became more frequent, always carefully timed to avoid suspicion. During one of their early encounters, Thomas arrived at Margaret's cottage to help fix a leaky faucet. As they worked side by side in the cramped space of her bathroom, the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Their hands brushed accidentally, sending electric shocks through both of them. When Margaret reached past Thomas for a towel, he caught the scent of her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and vanilla that made his head swim. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment, neither could look away. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Margaret was showing Thomas how to prune her rose bushes. As she demonstrated the technique, standing close behind him to guide his hands, both were acutely aware of their physical proximity. The gentle brush of her breath on his neck and the warmth of her body against his back sent shivers down Thomas's spine. When he turned to ask a question, their faces were inches apart. Time seemed to stand still as they stood there, frozen in a moment of forbidden desire. During a rare moment alone at a family gathering, Thomas and Margaret stole away to the garden behind the house, hidden from view by a trellis covered in climbing roses. They gave in to their desires. Their kisses were urgent, hands roaming with a desperation born of stolen moments. As they heard Rebecca's voice calling for them, they quickly separated, straightening their clothes and hair. The guilt was immediate, but so was the thrill of their secret affair, adding a dangerous excitement to their illicit encounters. Their affair consumed them, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. In Margaret's bedroom, a space once reserved for solitary nights, they now created a world of secret passion. The creak of bed springs and hushed whispers became a symphony of their illicit love, playing out against the backdrop of familial betrayal. As their physical intimacy deepened, so too did their emotional entanglement. What had started as a physical attraction morphed into something more complex and dangerous. They began to imagine a future together, heedless of the devastation such dreams would wreak on their family. It was this combination of physical passion and emotional connection that would ultimately lead to their undoing. They justified their actions in whispered conversations. Thomas spoke of feeling unappreciated and misunderstood by Rebecca, while Margaret confessed to a loneliness that had plagued her since her husband's death. They convinced themselves that their connection was special, something that transcended the boundaries of the conventional. As the affair deepened, so did their web of lies. Thomas began to invent business trips and late meetings. Margaret feigned illness to avoid family gathering. They communicated through a secret email account and disposable phones, always careful to cover their tracks. But with each deception, the weight of guilt grew heavier. Thomas found it increasingly difficult to look Rebecca in the eye, while Margaret's interactions with her daughter became strained and awkward. The very relationship that had once been Rebecca's source of comfort was now tainted by betrayal. Neither Thomas nor Margaret could have foreseen the devastating consequences their actions would have on the entire Winslow family. As they continued their illicit liaison, they remained oblivious to the suspicions beginning to form in Rebecca's mind. The first inkling that something was amiss came to Rebecca on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had decided to surprise Thomas with lunch at his office, only to be told by his confused secretary that he had left early, mentioning a meeting with a client. Rebecca brushed it off as a miscommunication, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, Rebecca began to notice subtle changes in Thomas's behavior. He was more distracted, often lost in thought during their conversations. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would step out of the room to take calls in hushed tones. When questioned, Thomas would dismiss her concerns with vague explanations about work stress and important deals in the pipeline. Rebecca's artistic sensitivity, usually a source of joy in her life, now became a curse as she picked up on minute details that others might have missed. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on Thomas's clothes, a lipstick smudge on a coffee mug he brought home from the office, the way he sometimes avoided her touch. All these observations accumulated in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Her relationship with her mother also began to change. Margaret, once eager to spend time with her daughter, now seemed distant and preoccupied. Their weekly tea sessions became less frequent, with Margaret often canceling at the last minute, citing various commitments. When they did meet, Rebecca sensed a nervousness in her mother's demeanor, a reluctance to meet her eyes that was entirely out of character. As her suspicions grew, Rebecca found herself trapped in a spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. She questioned every interaction, analyzed every word spoken by Thomas and Margaret. Was she imagining things? Had the stress of their fertility struggle and her upcoming exhibition made her paranoid? Determined to find the truth, Rebecca began to investigate discreetly. She checked Thomas's credit card statement, noting several charges at restaurants and hotels that he had never mentioned. She drove by her mother's cottage at odd hours, her heart sinking when she spotted Thomas's car parked down the street on an evening when he was supposedly working late. Each new piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, chipping away at the foundation of trust that had been the bedrock of her life. Rebecca's students and colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. The dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands as she demonstrated brush techniques, a forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. As the days passed, Rebecca became a shadow of her former self, torn between confronting her fears and clinging to the last shreds of hope that she was mistaken. Little did she know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be even more devastating than she could have imagined. The day Rebecca's world shattered began like any other. It was a Saturday, and she had spent the morning at the school, putting the finishing touches on the student art exhibition. Thomas had left early, mumbling something about a golf game with clients. As Rebecca drove home, her mind preoccupied with last-minute details for the upcoming show, she decided on a whim to stop by her mother's cottage. Perhaps a cup of tea and a chat would help calm her nerves. As Rebecca turned onto the quiet lane leading to Margaret's home, her heart nearly stopped. There, parked behind the cottage, was Thomas's sleek black sedan. For a moment, Rebecca sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation. Deep down, she knew. With trembling legs, Rebecca approached the cottage. Curtains were drawn, but through a gap, she could see movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she used her key to unlock the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The sight that greeted her would be forever seared into her memory. There, on the floral-patterned couch, they were locked in an intimate embrace, oblivious to the world around them. Margaret's hair was disheveled, and Thomas's shirt was partially unbuttoned. On the coffee table, 2 half-empty wine glasses stood as mute witnesses to their betrayal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if sensing her presence, Thomas and Margaret looked up. The expressions on their faces, shock, guilt, and a flicker of defiance, were unmistakable. What followed was a blur of emotions and accusation. Rebecca's anguished cry broke the silence, startling the guilty pair. Thomas jumped to his feet, stammering excuses and pleas. Margaret remained seated, her face ashen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Rebecca, her voice raw with pain and fury, hurled questions at them. The answers, when they came, were like daggers to her heart. 6 months. It had started as friendship, then evolved. They hadn't meant for it to happen. They were sorry. Unable to bear their presence any longer, Rebecca fled the cottage. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind replaying the scene over and over. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the house she had once considered her sanctuary. As she sat in the darkened living room, surrounded by the trappings of her seemingly perfect life, Rebecca felt something inside her break. Pain, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of the deception. In that moment, a cold resolve began to form in her heart. Someone would have to pay for this betrayal, and Rebecca knew exactly who that someone would be. Hey crime case solvers, interested in more in real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, and if you have any thoughts about this case or have a case of your own you would like us to investigate, leave us a comment. Stay safe, crime case solvers. The events leading up to the fatal confrontation unfolded over several tense hours on that warm summer evening. Rebecca, having spent the day in a haze of grief and anger, found herself pacing the halls of her home like a caged animal. The tick of the clock in the foyer seemed to mock her, counting down the moments until her world would irrevocably change. As dusk fell, Thomas returned home. He entered cautiously, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. Rebecca watched from the shadows of the dining room as he hung up his jacket and loosened his tie, familiar routine now tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal. Thomas called out Rebecca's name, his voice strained with apprehension. When she stepped into the light, visibly flinched. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant, loving wife he had known. Rebecca's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. Thomas, his face a mask of guilt and desperation, launched into a litany of excuses and apologies. He spoke of feeling neglected, of the pressures of work and their fertility struggles. He claimed the affair had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. With each word, Rebecca felt her anger rising, a tide of rage threatening to overwhelm her. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Rebecca found herself walking to Thomas's study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, a precaution he had insisted on after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. As if in a trance, she retrieved the weapon, feeling its cold weight in her hand. When she returned to the living room, Thomas's eyes widened in shock and fear. He raised his hands, backing away slowly, his words now coming in a panicked rush. He promised to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to save their marriage. But Rebecca barely heard him. In her mind, she saw only images of Thomas and Margaret together, their betrayal playing on an endless loop. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Thomas lunged forward, perhaps trying to disarm her. In that moment of chaos and heightened emotion, Rebecca's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confines of the room, followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the tinkling of shattered glass from a fallen picture frame. Thomas staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face as he pressed his hand to his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt crimson. Collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes locked on Rebecca in a silent plea. As the reality of what she had done crashed over her, Rebecca dropped the gun. It clattered to the hardwood floor, the sound jolting her out of her shocked state. She rushed to Thomas's side, her anger instantly replaced by horror and regret. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood. Thomas's breathing was labored, his skin growing pale. With trembling hands, Rebecca reached for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she gave the dispatcher their address, pleading for an ambulance to hurry. As she waited for help to arrive, she cradled Thomas's head in her lap, whispering a mixture of apologies and pleas for him to hold on. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshot, began to gather outside. Through the window, Rebecca could see curious faces peering in, their expressions shifting from concern to shock as they took in the scene. She heard muffled voices, someone shouting about calling the police. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked swiftly to stabilize Thomas. Rebecca watched, numb with shock, as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. As the sirens faded into the distance, Rebecca found herself alone in the house, surrounded by the evidence of her actions. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Detective Claire Bennett took charge of the scene, keen eyes taking in every detail as officers secured the area and began collecting evidence. Detective Bennett approached Rebecca, who sat motionless on the blood-stained couch. In a gentle but firm voice, Detective Bennett informed Rebecca of her rights and asked if she understood what had happened. Rebecca, her voice barely audible, recounted the events of the day, the discovery of the affair, confrontation, and the moment the gun went off. Throughout her statement, she seemed almost detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. As Rebecca was led away in handcuffs, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She caught glimpses of her neighbors watching from behind hastily drawn curtains, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. At the Massachusetts General Hospital, Thomas Winslow clung to life in the intensive care unit. The bullet had missed his heart by mere inches, lodging dangerously close to his spine. As he underwent multiple surgeries, a steady stream of colleagues and family friends visited, their hushed conversations in the waiting room filled with speculation and disbelief. Margaret Lawson, racked with guilt and shame, attempted to visit her son-in-law but was turned away by the Winslow family. She retreated to her cottage, refusing to answer calls or open her door. The weight of her role in the tragedy seemed to age her overnight, her once vibrant demeanor replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed look. Detective Bennett, meanwhile, delved deeper into the case. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and family members, piecing together the events that had led to that fateful night. The more she uncovered about the Winslow family's history and the affair between Thomas and Margaret, the more complex the case became. As the investigation progressed, public opinion in Wellesley began to shift. What had initially been seen as a clear-cut case of attempted murder in a fit of rage was revealed to be a tragedy born of betrayal and shattered trust. The town found itself divided, with some sympathizing with Rebecca's plight, while others condemned her actions as inexcusable. Regardless of the circumstances, one of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. Rebecca's best friend and fellow art teacher, Melissa Green, came forward with a series of text messages. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Rebecca had confided her growing suspicions to Melissa, detailing the signs of infidelity she had noticed. The messages revealed Rebecca's emotional turmoil and her struggle to confront the truth, providing valuable insight into her state of mind. Inside the packed courtroom, air was thick with tension. The judge called the proceedings to order. The prosecution, led by the ambitious district attorney Ethan Harris, painted a picture of Rebecca as a vengeful woman who had committed a premeditated act of violence. Harris argued that the shooting was not a crime of passion, but a calculated attempt to punish both her husband and her mother for their betrayal. Rebecca's defense team, headed by seasoned attorney Jonathan Morales, presented a different narrative. They portrayed Rebecca as a victim of circumstances, a woman pushed to the brink by an unthinkable betrayal. Morales emphasized Rebecca's impeccable character, her contributions to the community, and the extreme emotional distress she had been under at the time of the shooting. In their closing arguments, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned pleas to the jury. Harris emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice, while Morales urged the jury to consider the extraordinary circumstances and Rebecca's otherwise exemplary life. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, a hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Rebecca Winslow now rested in their hands, and with it, resolution of a tragedy that had shaken the town of Wellesley to its core. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Rebecca Winslow guilty of aggravated assault, a lesser charge than the attempted murder the prosecution had pushed for. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs as the verdict was read, Rebecca standing stoically beside her attorney. The judge, taking into account Rebecca's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, sentenced her to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Additionally, Rebecca was mandated to undergo psychological counseling and complete an anger management program. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient, given the severity of the crime, while others believed it appropriately balanced justice with compassion. As Rebecca was led away from the courtroom, the weight of her actions and the long road ahead seemed to finally settle on her shoulder. Thomas, having recovered from his physical wounds, but forever changed by the experience, moved to a different state to start anew. He and Rebecca divorced during her incarceration, their communication limited to formal letters and occasional phone calls. Despite the pain of their shared past, there was a tentative forgiveness between them, born of mutual understanding and regret. Margaret retreated from public life entirely. She lived as a virtual recluse in her cottage, her only contact with the outside world being the occasional visit from a home health aide. The weight of her role in the tragedy had taken a severe toll on her health and spirit. As Wellesley slowly heals and life moves forward, the story of Rebecca, Thomas, and Margaret remains a powerful reminder of how quickly and irrevocably lives can change. It challenges us to examine our own relationships, to value the trust placed in us by our loved ones, and to consider the far-reaching impacts of our choices.